Hello everybody, this tutorial is on the new color features that have been added to Premiere Pro 2015, especially with the new Lumetri features that they've added. Premiere still has some of the older features that they've had, but they've kind of really revamped all the color correction features inside of Premiere. And one thing that they've really done is they've brought over a lot of features from their SpeedGrade professional color correction software, which has really made a significant improvement to just doing things in Premiere. And a lot of the times lately I found myself doing quick projects in Premiere instead of sending it over to SpeedGrade, because they have a lot of the features now installed in Premiere, which is really nice and convenient. But if you're going to be doing some, they still have, if we go under effects and go under video effects here, and go into the color correction, you'll see kind of all the old color correction filters that we're used to using. And the ones that in particular that you'll notice here, the ones with this 32 little plug-in right there. These items here will, anyone that has that 32 added to it right there will do nice high quality 32-bit float point graphics color correction, which does really nice accurate color correction. It keeps a lot of the color depth through the shot, and this is really built for doing color correction that can show on a large movie screen and hold up the nice colors that you have in a nice high definition image. Especially if you're shooting on something like the Red or the Alexa camera, you're going to be able to use these 32-bit float point graphics here to do color correction, and it's going to be very accurate color correction. Also installed in Premiere here now, that have been here for a little while, are this Lumetri presets. These Lumetri presets are brought over from SpeedGrade. These are all 32-bit float point graphics color adjustments as well. These are some presets that can be added. These are kind of like along the same line as what they call LUTs, lookup tables, which are pre-composed color effects and color grades made that can be added to clips. But one nice thing here that's been added is if we go up to this panel up top, right now we're under the editing workspace, I'm going to click on color, and this will bring up, this is the part that's really been revamped here. And one thing that they've added, they've gotten rid of their old version scopes, and they've added these Lumetri scopes. Let's go ahead and show these things here. These scopes are now borrowed from SpeedGrade here and put directly into Premiere, which is really, really nice. Down here what we've got is we've got our waveform monitor, we have our HLS vector scope, our YUV vector scope, a histogram, and an RGB parade. The ones that are most commonly used in color correction, the ones that I use the most, are going to be the waveform, the RGB parade, and the YUV vector scope up here. The HLS vector scope was borrowed from SpeedGrade, and the one that's a little bit more intuitive and the one that's more commonly used is going to be this YUV vector scope. And the YUV basically stands for the black channel. The U and V stand for, it used to be YCRCB, and it was the Y is the dark channel, which is your brightness levels, and then you have the color red, color blue. Is basically three channels, two controlling the color channels, the red and the blue channel, and mixing those two channels to get different colors, and then the darkness channels, the brightness, to get also different amounts of colors, because as you darken images or brighten them, you get brighter values in blues, brighter values in reds, and so on. But the ones, like I said, the ones we're mainly going to be using demonstrating is going to be this YUV vector scope, which is the most common, your RGB parade, and your waveform right here. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to bring up just this waveform, and let's talk about that. I'm going to right click and get rid of all these other items and leave the Luma waveform behind. Here it is. So let's take the waveform full screen. I'm going to move over this, hover my mouse over it, and hit the tilde key and go full screen. This is basically a representation of the frame that our playhead is on right now. And it is basically your brightness levels from left to right, or right to left. Things over here on this side are going to be images on your left-hand screen, in the middle of your screen, and the right-hand part of your screen, from left to right or right to left. And what this is the IRE scale right here. It starts at 0, basically. I mean, you go below 0, but it starts at 0 and ends at 100 for basically all purposes that we need here. At 0, this represents, in the IRE scale, IRE stands for Institute of Radio Engineers. It's basically a standard set up by the Institute of Radio Engineers for measuring luminance levels. This is brightness levels. This really doesn't have anything to do with colors. The waveform doesn't. The Luma waveform does not. Down at 0, this measures, at 0, this represents where your image will lose detail in the darker regions of your image, in the blacks basically. Up here at 100, this is where your details disappear in the whites. So this is underexposure, and then this is crushed details in the darks, and up here at 100, this is overexposed, and this is where details will start disappearing and turning white. And everything in between represents your mids. Especially this region, kind of your mid exposure range is going to be basically from 40 IRE to 60 IRE. So you'll go bright as you move down. It will start getting darker and darker kind of into your general exposure area, and then it will start getting really dark down here. So your darks, your mids, and your highlights. Now if we go and look at this image right here, you'll notice as we move over from left to right, so we hit this point here, we see some detail that's almost hitting 100 up here. It's not quite there, it's around 80. That's going to be basically this region probably right there. This seems really bright, but the detail has not been crushed completely yet. Over here, it looks like we got a little bit of detail kind of clipping there, but it's measured around 80. This was red footage that was re-encoded as ProRes, so it did flatten some stuff here. It looked like it was probably kind of flattened and compressed. Looks like that little highlighted image right there represents a little bit of crushed detail. But actually, if we grab this image here and we bring the exposure down, you're going to notice there is still kind of color and detail in these regions here, and even a little bit here and here in the sky. So even these crushed regions here, we still have detail if we bring that exposure down. So that detail still exists, which is good. Now you notice the dark region, maybe this like knot right here as we move over about right here. This probably represents the knot, the area of the knot. Actually, that's going to be a little bit further over here toward the end of the image, maybe like right about there. We're seeing that we're still getting detail in the darker regions of this image, like here and over here we're still getting detail, and if we boost up the exposure you're going to see detail in that region, or you get really close to that image we can still see detail in here. If we bring down the exposure to where we crash that, let's actually bring down the darks here, you're going to notice we start losing detail as these items start to hit zero down here. And you usually want to avoid that, and you want to avoid crushing out detail for the most part. That's generally speaking. And I'll reset that there. But that's kind of the way a waveform monitor works. Let's go to the RGB parade next and demonstrate that. Now let's show the otoscopes here. I'm going to right click now, and we're going to tell this to show, instead of the waveform, we're going to tell it to show the parade, the RGB parade. We're going to get rid of the vector or the waveform over here. We're going to show another type of waveform here that now has an individual. Every video channel has a that we're working with will have a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel. Those three channels blended together creates a full color image. So when you blend those three channels together, then you get your full colored image here. And oftentimes what this here can be used for is brightness levels as well, but it's going to show basically what channel is more dominant in any shot that you're using. If you're using a shot that looks more, if it's been color temperatured a little too warm or a little too cool, it's going to show either a higher push in the blue values or a higher push in the red values, or sometimes higher push in the green values. And you can manipulate these channels individually to get a properly colored, color balanced shot. If we move to this shot right here, this looks maybe a little bit too warm, just by looking at this image right here. And if we go over to the scope, sure enough we can tell that we got some kind of a push in the highlights on the reds, especially up in the kind of upper regions of the reds. And looks like the kind of the darks are about balanced, but somewhere towards the mids and the highlights you're getting a push in red. So this color looks a little too much. Now if you're going to balance that, like I said, we're going to be getting the scopes, but watch this as we pull the temperature more toward the blue. Look what happens to our image, and it becomes more balanced here. This shot maybe looks a little too bluish now, but look what happens. The difference, watch before and after. There's the warm shot. There's a little bit corrected there. And now we look over here. This looks a little bit more balanced. There are still some issues. We got a bigger push in the darks, and we can change those, and we'll show you how to do that later. But if you can get these things where they're looking fairly close, where every channel is looking fairly close, your shot will look more accurate or look more color balanced. I'm going to go to my effects controls and hit reset on this. Anytime you start changing anything over here, it's going to change. It's going to add a Lumetri color filter. We'll get into this in a little bit. I'm going to reset that and get it back to normal. But we will use this. If the color on your image is too warm or too cool or too green, you can go and manipulate an individual color channel to get your shot to look more balanced. Let's go to the YUV vector scope here. I'm going to get rid of the parade for a moment, and let's talk about the vector scope here. YUV vector scope is basically a representation of your hue and saturation of any shot. Hue is basically your color balance. It's showing what sort of, and it will show kind of a concentration of pixels here. If you look down here, that's really bright here. It's got a lot of kind of highlighted pixels here, a very heavy concentration of pixels that are pushing off towards the red and yellow. So you can tell that this image has kind of a shared red and yellow hue to it, very red and yellow. And then it has some highlights. It has some kind of other items here kind of pushing off. Some more saturated pixels toward, a little less saturated pixels going off towards the red, and a little bit toward red and magenta, and a little bit toward the yellow there. And very little is going to the blue. So this is heavily kind of a warmer image just looking at this. Now the further these pixels spread out, means the more saturation there is in the image. If you have kind of a light faint line, that means there's kind of a light, just a few, not very many pixels that are kind of getting a very heavy saturation. But if you have kind of these white points in here, this represents kind of a heavy region of not super saturated pixels. There is some good color here, but it's not overly saturated. These are considered HD limits out here. As you come out to these points right here, you're not really supposed to go beyond these points in those color regions right there, or it's kind of passing what's considered saturation legality. In a lot of broadcast stations, if you have overly saturated images or too bright images or things that break the IRE scale, then they won't accept it. They won't be showing it on their station. Now what we've got here on the vector scope is we've got our red channel, we've got our green channel, and we've got our blue channel. This is kind of a representation of the three color channels here. But as you go between the red and the green, it also gives you your yellow region. As you go between the green and the blue, you've got your cyan region. And between the blue and the red, you've got your magenta region. This is demonstrated on color wheels right here. You'll see this color wheel right here on the Lumetri panel, and also within the Premiere Color Corrector, you'll see this as well, a big wheel that has all the colors that we're dealing with here. Like we mentioned, over here you've got green. Notice down here you've got green. And as you go up, you've got your red and blue. You got your red, green, blue as shown over here in your scope. Now, with a shot like this where you got a kind of a push over toward the red and the yellows, you can grab your midtones and drag them over toward the blue. And look at the vector scope as I do so. It's adding a little bit more blue to this shot, and it is starting to color balance a little bit. But you can use your vector scope here to judge your general hue of your shot. And notice we are starting to get more of a push of concentration of pixels towards the blue and cyan now, and look at our image. Look at the before and after. And you can just kind of do that on a smaller scale to kind of get this balanced where it doesn't look so terribly orange. And under the basic color panel here, you'll notice I want to demonstrate saturation as well. Everything is measured from this midpoint over here, from this midpoint right here. This little point down here means no saturation, and as it goes out toward the outer regions here, you'll get more saturation. Right now we have a bit of saturation going toward the reds and yellows and a little bit toward the blue as mentioned, but watch what happens as we grab our saturation slider and drag it up. We're getting a heavily colored image here. Everything is very, very oversaturated, heavy yellows, some heavy kind of between the yellows and reds there, but really a very yellowish looking color here as we're boosting up our saturation. Sometimes you can boost this up, exaggerate this just to see where your main push in your image is going, and then you can use your temperature slider to kind of back things off and change things. But now watch what happens is we grab this and drag it down to 0. Look at the vector scope here as I drag this down to 0. It all sucks into the middle point there, and suddenly this image is black and white. Everything's been sucked down to a point there. We go to the effects controls, reset this, and we're going to demonstrate that because I changed some things on the midtones. Going to the basic color correction. Watch our scope here as we take it down, take the saturation down, and it brings it down to a fine point, which means this image is black and white. There is no saturation in this shot. Basically, it has been, all the color has been removed in the shot, and we're left with a color image. We're left with a black and white image. Watch what happens when we go to the Luma, to our waveform here, and get rid of our YUV vector scope. As we grab our saturation and move it up and down, notice what happens to our waveform. Virtually nothing is happening over here because this scope is mainly dealing with brightness levels and contrast levels and not color. So that's just kind of a basic explanation of these scopes and how we're going to be using them and how we're going to be using them for accurate color correction. So let's get started on this. On this next section here, we're going to be going through the Lumetri panel and kind of showing everything that exists here in this Lumetri panel. These are not all the color correction features in Premiere. These are the nice kind of convenient ones borrowed from SpeedGrade. These are kind of the nice, quick, intuitive ones that they've borrowed from SpeedGrade. A lot of this kind of powerful ones they've borrowed from SpeedGrade. You still have access to all the old original filters as we showed at the beginning of the tutorial. But we're going to go through each one of these channels. The beginning, or the basic correction, creative, curves, color wheels, and vignette. These nice little features they've added here. So let's go to the basic correction here and talk about that. First of all, under the basic correction, you have this input LUT. It's basically an input lookup table here. You can kind of start with a certain look if you've been shooting on it, if you're trying to get something to match a certain look from a certain camera. If you've been working on Blackmagic Raw, or you're working on Arri, or you're working on Red or something else, you can tell it to start off with these certain looks. This is red footage here, but it's not the raw red footage. This was encoded to ProRes because this was just a simple 30-second commercial that was being shot that was just going to be broadcast. I'm going to go to Red Log Film and show you what it shows up. If this was actual red footage, it would be encoding this properly. It would look like very flat footage. Right now, if we go to Canon 5D, you can kind of start off with the Canon 5D look. Depending on the cameras that you're looking and you're trying to match them, you can use a lookup table, basically. If you're trying to get this to look like a specific camera that wasn't shot on this camera, you can have it start off with a very specific look from a different camera. And you can kind of experiment with some of these and see what they do, but I usually will not use those. You can also browse and import different LUTs if you've created different LUTs, but I'm going to choose none on this. This is really kind of where the heavy feature, the basic correction, comes in right here. With your white balance, kind of basic color temperature correction here. You have a magenta, and you have basically your warm and cool slider, kind of an RGB slider up here. And down here on this one, you're going to have your tint slider, which is basically your magenta, yellows, and cyans. So depending on how you're trying to correct this image here, let's go to the next image right here. We'll really get into correction later, but I want to show kind of the basics of these. This is a kind of a warm shot, so you can grab your temperature and basically just drag it to the cool slider right here. If the shot looks too green or too magenta, you can kind of drag it toward the opposite pole here and add more magenta or add more green to your shot. So you can usually use these two sliders here to get kind of a basic correction of a general image right here. And we're going to get into that when we start color correcting these shots here. Tone here, you have exposure, which is basically the overall exposure of the shot. You have contrast. Contrast is basically going to darken darks while brightening the highlights. And you'll get the spread on this waveform. We will get into that as well. Watch what happens. This is going to make the image more flat as things pull together here toward the center. And as you drag it the opposite region, you're going to get more contrast. It will spread out the darks and the highlights and spread this image out over your entire waveform graph here. You have your highlights, which will control mainly the highlights of your image. The brighter, if you want to bring them up brighter or bring them down a little bit. Your shadow slider here. And your whites and blacks are essentially the same thing as the highlights and shadows. It controls a wider range. To bring down the whites, it's going to control a wider range of the highlights here. The highlights is actually kind of this top section from like 70 IRE up, or the top section of your image here, while the whites do more of a broad range. It's basically the top half of your image, and the blacks are basically the bottom half of your image. So these are a little bit more global, while these shadows and highlights are a bit more specific. Going to reset this, and then you also have your saturation slider here, which is the amount of color you have in your image. So you can drag it all the way down to 0, you have black and white, or you can drag it all the way up, and you have a very boosted, saturated, overly saturated image. I'm going to reset this, and let's go down to the next panel. Our creative panel. They call this the creative panel. You'll have a whole bunch of presets built into this. I kind of consider this the non-creative panel because you're not really getting creative as much as implementing creative looks that somebody else has created for you. And I use this sometimes. If you're in a hurry, this is really kind of nice to just click on this and choose some pre-built looks that have been added into here. And you can also browse. You can create custom ones on your own. You can browse and find new ones. If you've exported some from SpeedGrade, you can import looks into your creative panel here. Let's demonstrate this really quick. As we arrow through these, it'll show the new looks. It'll show the name right here. And if you find one that you like, kind of a look that you like the Cinespace, basically just double click on it and it adds it to your clip here. This is way oversaturated, so we can actually grab the intensity slider and move that down if you find a look that you like, and we will get into this. And then you have some adjustments to these looks that have been added. You can add the faded film look. You can sharpen your pixels a little bit. We will get into these and we'll show you how to use these things to get this to look the way you want it to look. Vibrance is basically deals with the vibrance of the colors, how lively the colors are, and then saturation slider as well gets a big boost, or pulling it down to black and white. So you also have a saturation slider here. You can also within the creative panel, you can also alter the shadow colors and the highlight colors here. And then you have a tint balance as well to change kind of the color of the tint that your look is adding. And then once you're done, you can actually go up here and add that as a custom look once you've created one that you like. So let's reset this panel here. I'm going to go to the effect controls. When you start manipulating items here, it's going to add a Lumetri effect to your clip here. I'm going to go to that and just actually either delete it or reset it. I'm going to hit delete and go down to curves. Curves are mainly for contrast here. Not necessarily. You do have some other items as well. You can actually manipulate red channels individually. This is basically for manipulating contrast. We're really going to get into details on this, but you can add what's called an S-curve. You can grab a portion of the image. Now this is your global contrast right here. You can bring down the brightness levels. You can bring them down while bringing up the highlights, and you're going to create contrast. We'll kind of explain this in a little bit and explain what's going on here. You can also manipulate individual color channels. You can bring down and suppress the reds in the image here and boost up the blues at the same time. And you're going to get very, very blue image as a result, and you'll get very different looks. Or you can grab your green, and up here you have your different colors, and we're going to get into that. They've also added the saturation curve, which is really nice. If you're trying to highlight a very specific color like yellow, you can actually add curve points on a very specific color where it will leave other colors alone and just manipulate a specific color channel. If I click on the yellow button right there, it's added these nodes here. You can actually boost it up or suppress it, and we'll get into that and show some practical examples of it. You have your color wheels. You have your color wheels as well. If you've used speed grade, you'll be familiar with these. I'm going to go over and reset my looks here, reset that panel, or reset the entire Lumetri effect. And you've got basically contrast and brightness sliders over here for your shadows. You can darken your shadows, you can bring up your midtones, your exposure, and bring down your highlights, manipulate them over here, or you can change the colors in your shadows, the colors in your midtones, and the colors in your highlights right here. So a very nice feature added there as well. And then kind of a cool little thing here, if you like vignettes, you can add a vignette. This is very common to a lot of newer movies. They use vignettes to kind of highlight certain portions of the screen. This is kind of a basic vignette adder here, but it's really nice and quick. As we grab this amount, you can see as we boost it up, this adds a brightened vignette, a highlighted vignette around the edge. If you take it the other way, it's going to add a darkened vignette. And then you have these features that kind of manipulate the vignette and change it. As you notice, if you watch movies and commercials and everything these days seem to be using vignettes have become very common because they draw attention to a specific part of the screen. But this is a very basic vignette creator here. Then you have the feathered edge and go hard edged or feathered. So with that quick introduction of these features here in the Lumetri color panel, let's reset this and we're going to show how to start color correcting. I'm going to get rid of the Lumetri panel there, and we're going to go to the beginning of this sequence and begin color correcting this project and show some practical ways of getting the color correction the way you need it and want it. So let's start off with this first shot here. As we're playing through this commercial here, we see these feet walk out and we see this guy walk out. So here's our very first shot we're going to work with right here. Now some things here is the general exposure in the shade here is a little bit dark, and the highlight out here, because this is the way it was shot, it's very dark under here and very bright out here. So let's kind of work on that. Actually, I'm going to bring up my scopes and kind of look at this image here. Two things. First of all, I'm going to keep up just for general color correction purposes. I'm going to keep open my Luma waveform and my YUV vector scope. So I've got these two open right here, and I'm going to be looking at this shot. Another thing I want to bring up is my RGB parade, actually. So let's have all three of these up. So looking at the color of this image here, it looks like it is somewhat color balanced. We have kind of a similar darkness level in the reds, greens, and blues here. But notice we've got a little bit of highlight push on the blues here, and that's probably from these levels out here. So if we mess with this, let's kind of mess with this. Let's go into our basic correction here and grab our temperature slider and start sliding this around and see what we get. See, now as we bring down our blues, you'll notice this shot warms up a little bit. We just started pulling this over towards the reds, and notice the blue channel came down, the red went up, and if we can kind of get this to where these three highlights are balanced, the image should look fairly balanced here. So I'm going to manipulate our tint slider and our temperature slider, and this will work for most shots. It's not going to work for every single shot. Sometimes you're going to have to get in there and really manipulate things, but there we go. Let's take a look at a before and after. I'm going to uncheck my basic correction. So there's before, kind of a little bit of a magenta blue on it, and there's the corrected. Now this seems a little bit more warm, kind of the deserty region. It looks a little bit more warm now. So just a slight manipulation of these colors here got us to that point right there. Let's talk about our exposure here. And what you want to avoid is your highlights peaking at 100 and your darks crushing at 0. So that's one thing we want to avoid with exposure here. So I'm going to grab my exposure and I'm going to boost this up here and see what we get. I'm going to boost that up, and we got a little bit more exposure here, but now it also brought up the highlights out here. So actually I can go to my whites and bring those down. So I brought up my exposure, and I brought up the exposure here and brought down the whites, and now we don't have, now it looks like it's a little brighter here, but it's not so extreme now. Let's look at the before and after. See, it's darker there. And just a slight fix there, and we could actually stand to bring up a little bit more exposure there, a little bit more, right about there. Because we'd still want it to look like it's in the shadows, just not so extreme, and bring down the highlights, the whites. Or you can actually manipulate just the highlights just to get the section of highlights there. And there we go. So there's a before and after. And we're on our way. So now that is kind of the first step. Is you usually start working with just the general color scheme and the brightness levels of your shot and fixing the brightness levels. Next, I want to work with contrast. Contrast, I'm going to bring up our Luma waveform here, get rid of my parade for a moment, and look at how a lot of the image is kind of pulled together here into this region right there, into the 30-20 region. This is a very flat image. Everything's kind of pulled together here. If you get the highlights and stretch them up and grab the darks and pull them down, that is going to basically give you contrast. And look what happens as we do contrast here. And this is going to do it automatically. There's some other ways to do this, but this is kind of cool in the basic color correction panel. Very quick. I'm going to grab this and increase the contrast and look at that region stretching there. And look what happens to the image. As our waveform stretches, we get more of a cinematic look. Film tends to shoot with more contrast than does video. So the video here, but the video gives us more options in post-production here. So that is one of the benefits of working on digital video as opposed to film, is that you don't have kind of a flattened look when you're done. You have you've got a lot of latitude for correction. But now look at our basic correction. Let's check this on and off, like before and after, and we got kind of a nice contrasty look. And notice our blacks aren't reaching 0. They're around like 5 IRE, which is good, and our highlights are reaching almost around 90. So that's really good as well. Our highlights aren't blown out, our darks aren't crushed, and we still have some image and some contrast left. So let's go to the next shot and kind of do the same here. Let's go to the next shot here. As we cut to the next shot, play out of this and cut to the next shot. And if you notice one thing, watch this. I'm going to uncheck this. And as you play, one thing you want to do with color correction is you want to match shots from shot to shot. As we play from this shot to the next, those obviously do not match in color. But if we check mark this here and turn it back on, notice that is a lot closer. These things are closer to matching now. But let's work on this next shot here. Temperature. Let's go to our vector scope and look at kind of the general, our vector scope YUV, and look at the colors in this image right here. This shows that we do have a big push towards the reds and yellows and a teeny bit toward the blue. Not much in the blue channel here. So I'm going to use my temperature slider and my tint slider to kind of get a little bit more of a push toward the blues. Just cool it off a teeny bit right about there. And that's really all I have to do. But you can use this vector scope to kind of gauge where that direction needs to go. So I'm going to move this over. Look at this shot here. We do have kind of a little bit more saturation in this shot, so if I want to match the saturation, it's about the same actually. We could boost the saturation a little bit and see what we get. Sometimes you can slide the saturation all the way up and see you really have a big push toward the yellows there. So we could actually cool that off a little bit. Let's manipulate these here. We're going to get into color wheels, which is a better way of manipulating some images, but your saturation will help show you what you need to do to correct a shot here. I'm going to reset that. Grab the temperature and slide it a little bit more toward the cool. There we go. And now I can do the same thing. I'm going to go to my waveform, and for this shot we're going to correct this. We're going to add, let's mess with exposure. This seems like a little bit overexposed, so I'm going to bring down the exposure level a teeny bit, right about there. I'm going to add some contrast to this image. And I don't really need to manipulate the highlights and bring down the highlights, but we could play with those to see kind of what we get here. Maybe we can actually boost them a little bit and add a little bit more contrast to the image. And there we go. And that's basically how you use this panel to do some basic corrections. Let's go to the next panel here. We're going to use I'm going to skip the creative right now. We are going to get into that because this is kind of like a final look that we're going to be adding to our entire project here. So I'm going to skip that. I'm going to show you a little trick to messing with the creative here. So we're going to go under curves right now. Curves are kind of a different way of manipulating your contrast, messing with your contrast. The way a curve works basically is you have down here at the bottom left-hand corner, this is your dark node right here. Up here is your highlights node right there. And this represents total white and this represents total black down here. As you grab your darks and you drag this node toward the total black region, you'll notice this will get darker and darker until it crushes it and it's completely black. Same with the highlights. You're going to grab your highlights. You're going to grab your highlights and you grab this and drag it down. You're going to notice the highlights are going to be dipping until this thing is completely crushed and goes black. So this is your highlights up here. This is your blacks, and anything in between are your mids. And this one, if you're on white right here, this is manipulating all three channels at once, your entire image. So if we grab our mids and pull them up to this region here, they're going to be totally blown out. And if we grab our mids and drag them down to this region here, they're going to be totally crushed and darkened. And it does this on a curve, depending on where your nodes are. So it will gradually kind of increase into wherever your nodes are and gradually kind of fall out of those regions. This is really nice because you can get your images without bringing your darks down and crushing your darks. You'll see some people add contrast where they just grab the dark and drag it way down and they crush their darks where the detail is gone. Notice all the detail lost in there, and then they will bring their highlights and bring it up like this, and then they get a kind of a crushed image. It's kind of ugly, and this is what a lot of amateurs do in color correction. I'm just going to reset this here. You can reset a panel just by double clicking on it, and it will reset it back to normal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up a little bit into a little bit of the upper ends of the darks here. I'm going to add a node there. I'm going to go up here into my highlights and add a node there. So without crushing the details in the black, now I can pull the darks down toward the dark area here just a little bit and grab my highlights and actually bring them down, and notice the stretching that occurs right here. We just added, this is a quick, nice way of doing contrast without crushing the darks. And actually we have our highlights right here. I want to bring that down right there. So this is just another way of manipulating the luminance of your image and create a little bit of contrast, kind of a cinematic look without crushing the details out of your images using the curve. I'm going to double click on this. If you're also trying to suppress very specific channels, the curves is a nice way to do it. I'm going to go to our RGB parade and do some color balancing here. Turn off my vector scope, turn off my waveform, and I'm going to look at this. We've got some highlights in the red here, and actually our red channel is our green channel is kind of suppressed a little bit toward the darks, but the highlights are there. So say we want to bring up the greens just a little bit here. You can actually click on the green, and it brings up just the green channel. So now I can go down toward the bottom, and I can boost the darker regions of my green to match the blue. I can grab the highlights of my green and bring them down to match the blue. I can go to my red channel now. Now I notice my red channel is still kind of high, so I'm going to grab the red channel specifically. I'm going to grab the node from my red and get it to where it matches the others. I'm going to grab the top one here and drag that down and hit it right about there. So let's look at before and after. There's before, there's after. Not a huge difference, but that kind of gets your image. This works better if you see an image where it's obviously too blue or too red. If you get these three things to match here, that's where it's really going to look like a properly color balanced image. So this is a nice little feature they've added to the RGB curves here. Now I can go back to the white, and those channels that I've manipulated can stay the same, and I can add some contrast now if I'd like to the entire image. There we go. See, I don't like this kind of really white board there, so I'm going to bring down the highlights, bring it down here a little bit, and add a little bit more of an S curve here. It's called an S curve to add contrast and stretch that region out. So there's before, there's after. Okay, let's talk about the hue saturation curve down here. This is really nice to manipulate very specific color channels. There's one shot right here where this guy is supposed to have very yellow teeth here. So what I'm going to do is I want to bring out the yellows in the teeth here. Let's do some basic correction first of all. I'm going to go to the basic color corrector, and I'm going to look at my color channels. This has a big red push, so I'm going to pull my temperature down. Bring up the blue channel a little bit to kind of color balance that a little properly. There we go. Now I'm going to add some contrast to this without crushing the darks. I'm going to bring up my exposure a teeny bit. There we go. And do some basic corrections to this, and that's good enough right now. So now let's go to the curves here, and we're going to go to our hue saturation curve, and we're going to bring out the yellow color on this guy's teeth. So let's see a shot. Right there we get a good shot of his teeth. So we want to see that he's got really gross yellow teeth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to the yellow button here. I'm going to add a curve to the yellow region of my image right there. Click, and adds two nodes, so it'll leave all these other colors alone, and then in the middle node is the one you want to grab, and you can bring this out. And as I grab this and increase the saturation in the yellow here, I'll move this around and see where I really get that push in the teeth right there. And right about there. Let's give that a try. Let's uncheck this. And I'm not quite finding it there, so what I'm going to have to do is probably increase the range of yellows, drag this around here, And keep this, I'm going to keep this within the center here so it keeps all these colors kind of the same in the neutral zone here. I'm going to increase the yellow regions. And see, and now I'm starting to get more of a yellow coloration on the teeth without manipulating. This is kind of similar to what's called secondary color correction, where now it's just changing, it's boosting, oversaturating the yellows without affecting the other region, the other colors of the image. If I uncheck this and check mark it, notice his teeth gets really yellow, and you can actually see that yellow spike right there on his teeth happening on the vector scope. A lot of saturation on that. So now as we look at his teeth here, and I'm going to uncheck this on my curves, you can see kind of the before. That's before. Now watch as I check mark this. Watch his teeth. That's afterwards when we get some really gross yellow looking teeth that kind of exaggerate the yellowness in the teeth. So we go on to the next section here. Let's go on to the color wheels here. This is kind of just another tool to do basic color correction and basic brightness levels fix. If we go to this next clip here, and it brings up the color correction. The nice thing about the Lumetri panel is whatever you put the playhead over, it automatically selects that clip when you're in this Lumetri panel mode, and it will bring up the effect for that specific clip, and you just start going over and manipulating it, and it does whatever clip you have your playhead over. So as I'm over this image right here, let's do our basic corrections here. I'm going to go to my waveform, let's get rid of the other images here. And I'm going to bring down my shadows. I'm going to bring them down so I define my shadows around 5 IRE, generally speaking. I'm going to bring my exposure up, expose him a little bit more, and my highlights could actually be brought up. There's not a lot of highlights in this, but I'm going to actually bring up the highlights of the whites on the shirt, kind of clip a teeny bit, and maybe bring down the exposure right there. So that's what these sliders do. This is the brightness, those are shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. And now you can manipulate colors specifically in those shadows, in those midtones, and those highlights. We go to our vector scope. Actually, let's go to our RGB parade and look at this image. And it looks like we get kind of a little bit heavier on the red and a little tiny push in the blue. So we can actually bring go to our highlights, grab our highlights, and kind of bring down the blue a little bit. Like so. We can grab our midtones and drag those more toward the blues, and there we go. Now our image seems to be more properly color balanced to match our other images there. And we've added some contrast to it here. You can use the curves to do contrast, you can use the basic correction to do contrast. These are just different ways of manipulating an image. Now I can go into the curves and add some specific curves if I want to, and I can bring up my mids here and add some contrast to this image. So there I use my color wheels and my RGB curves to kind of get a contrasty look. This looks a little bit saturated. I'm going to go under my YUV vector scope and look at the saturation. It's got a bit kind of more concentrated areas of saturation, so I could tend to lose a little bit of saturation here. I can go up to my basic correction and grab my saturation and drag down my saturation a teeny bit. You can see that kind of sucking that in a little bit, and we get a little bit more of a desaturated image, not so boosted in the colors. So that's really kind of an overview of all these channels here, but now I'm going to show you how to kind of do the final touches on these things. Once you have, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and do a basic correction on all these items, and then I'm going to show you the next step, which is using the final touches. You can use the creative panel and the vignette panel to kind of finish this off. So let me do the color correction, and I will come right back. Actually, while I'm doing some color correction, I'm noticing one thing I want to point out as well is a couple of these shots here are kind of the exact same shot. Like right here, this shot I've corrected, and this previous shot I have not corrected yet. So that's a non-corrected shot. It basically cuts away from this and cuts back to it later. So one of these shots I've corrected and one shot I haven't. So actually I can go to this panel, go up to the effects controls right here, select this clip, and copy that Lumetri color panel there. Go to the other clip that doesn't have it yet and paste it. So I do use Command V or Control V on a PC and Command V on a Mac, Control V on a PC to paste it. Command C and V is copy and paste. I'm going to hit Command V as in Victor, paste it, and I've added that exact thing. So now I'm going to continue the color correction here. Same as here, we've got the yellow teeth right here, and we cut away from that and cut back to them. So I can grab this panel right here if that's corrected. Actually, that's got a little bit more of a magenta push, so I'm going to kind of warm that up a teeny bit and get them to match. I'm going to grab my Lumetri color panel, copy it, go to the clip where it cuts back to him, and paste, and I save time doing my color correction there. So going to correct the rest of this and come right back. Okay, so I've gone through this and I've done a lot of the basic corrections here. Now let's go through our creative panel and our vignette panel. So I want to kind of add the same sort of look to this entire clip instead of just doing it clip by clip. Actually go to my footage scene. Actually go to my main project window here. Let's show this in the list view. And I'm going to add an adjustment layer. This is those of you that use Premiere will be very familiar with adjustment layers. I'm going to go to adjustment layer. I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to grab this adjustment layer and drag it and put it on top. This adjustment layer will affect everything below it. So I'm going to select this clip here, and under my Lumetri panel, everything that I adjust here will affect the clips below it. So now I can go to my creative panel and kind of add a look for my entire film. And go through these. Let's go. Actually, what I'm going to do is go over one of these main shots, these kind of full color shots here, and kind of see what sort of looks we can give this that I like here. I'm going to click through these. I kind of like the CineSpace. It looks very Western. It's very, very strong, but we can back that off a little bit. Clean Punch HDR, high dynamic range. Looks okay. So far I'm going for the CineSpace one, and you have different types of film here. Fuji film, Kodak film. I'm going to find one that I like. Actually, so we make this Western. Let's go for Gold Heat. I'm going to double click on this, and it applies it to everything below this. That is very extreme. So now all I have to do is I grab the intensity and drag it down until I get it about where I like it, about right there. I like that look. Let's turn it on and off on our adjustment layer. And I really like that look. Now anything that's underneath this is going to be affected by that gold heat look that I've applied here. And it comes across pretty heavy. I might have to do some minor adjustments on these other clips below it, but it's added that look. See, like this one here is a little too contrasty, so I'm going to go back to my main clip here, not the adjustment layer, but my main clip, and back off the contrast a little bit under my basic correction here. Actually, that was under the curves there, so I'm going to kind of back off the curves a teeny bit to get it to match everything else. So you might have to do some minor manipulation after you've added that, after you've added the adjustment layer. I'm going to go back to the adjustment layer, go back to a clip here, and let's go under our creative panel, and we're going to add a little bit of a faded film effect. So it kind of looks like old film, just a little bit. I'm going to sharpen the pixels a teeny bit just to make it look like a nice clear image. And I'm going to increase, actually let's decrease saturation a teeny bit. And there we go. We've kind of created our own little look there based on that gold heat look. Now I'm going to go to vignette, and we're going to add a little bit of a vignette at the end. Going to actually, instead of highlight, we're going to make it darker around the edges. And let's change the midpoint, change the roundness. I'm going to take off the feather so I can kind of see where my vignette is. About right there. Right there, just so it's kind of out of the edge, outer corners there. And feather that a bit, turn the vignette on and off, and look at the before and after. And there we go. And there's our final color corrected image right there. Let's look at kind of a before and after. I'm going to go to both the adjustment layer and the clip, turn them both off here, and see what we have. There's our before image, looks very kind of video-ish. Now we're going to add our look and our color correction back, and there's our final image right there. So that's basically how the color correction panel, the Lumetri color panel, works in Premiere. It's very powerful, very fun to use, and you can kind of get away with doing some quick projects where you make them look really good really fast. This is really built for speed, and it uses the graphics card to do a lot of the 32-bit float point graphics to get some really nice high quality image out of your project. I'm going to post this project at the end of the tutorial here, and you can watch this this finished commercial.
What's the matter? You yellow?
No. I use platinum whites.
Success Dental Whitening System is the new face of professional at-home dental whitening. Effective, powerful, proven. A smile never goes out of style. Wear yours today.